Assalamu alaikum everyone, how are you guys doing? So a couple of days ago, there was somewhat of a controversy relating to a Muslim da'i, a Muslim speaker, in which he discussed the Hadiths. And I don't want to delve deep into who it was and exactly what he said, because that's not the point of this channel, to be a drama channel. What I do want to delve deep into is relating to the topic of Hadiths. Are hadiths reliable? This is something that even when I was in my undergraduate back in the States, I heard some Muslims and non-Muslims considering Islam have doubts about. That, okay, maybe the Quran is reliable, but what about the hadiths? Did the Prophet Muhammad, do we actually have the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? When we see a hadith that says Sahih, or when we see a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, can we actually say reliably and actually believe that those were actually the words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And in this video, I will be showing you guys why we can actually believe in the hadith literature. That when it comes to a hadith that says Sahih, to hadith found in Sahih Bukhari or Muslim, for instance, we can, without a shadow of a doubt, believe that those are the actual words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In order to do this, this video will be in three sections. First will be, what is hadith? What are hadiths? The second is, what is the science of hadith? Because this is the most important element to see how we preserved the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the last section is looking into the historical critical method and looking at some of the biases and criticisms that can be levied at the historical critical method. So I hope you guys enjoy this video, and let's begin. So to start off, what are hadiths? When we say hadiths, what does that mean? Well, in Islam, hadiths are the sayings, actions, and tacit approval of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And to better understand what hadiths are, let us take a look at an example. One of the most famous hadiths that most Muslims have memorized is the hadith of intentions. And the hadith goes as follows. Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu anhu said, سمعت رسول الله, I heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam يقول, say, إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Verily, actions are based on one's intentions. And the hadith goes on. There's a couple of things that need to be noted here, especially when we move on to the second section, discussing hadith sciences. The first is, prior to even saying that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, I said, Umar bin Khattab said that he heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say X. And what this means is, whenever you go to a book of hadith, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, you go to a book of jurisprudence, you will see that many times, or almost all the times, hadiths are never mentioned without mentioning the person who said they heard the Prophet ﷺ do X, or approve this, or that he said this thing. We always mention in the books of hadith the Sahabi, the companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who said they heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say X, Y, and Z. That is super important, especially when we get into the science portion of hadith literature. On any hadith, whenever you open up any books of hadith literature, you will see a Sahaba saying that they heard, they saw, whatever the case is, of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. سمعت Rasulullah, I heard. Umar bin Khattab is saying, I heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, إنما الأعمال بالنيات. That the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, verily, actions are based on one's intentions. And at the end of the hadith, you will see a grading, like Sahih. Sahih means that it is a sound hadith, that there's no really doubt that that's actually what Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. More into that later. In terms of the actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are reports of some of the Sahaba saying that I saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam raise his hands in prayer. For instance, that's what hadith is. Hadith is, I have the action of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a saying of him. In any hadith, you will generally see, in any hadith book or book that utilizes hadith, you will see that a Sahabi, a companion, said that he saw, that he heard, that he was commanded by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam about X, Y, and Z. That's generally how hadiths are. Now that we understand hadiths, we need to really delve deep into the science of hadith. How can we be so confident that when we read a hadith, we actually believe that those are the actual words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let us delve into the science of hadith. Now the science of hadith, there's kind of two parts to it. The first part is looking at the matan, looking at the text of the hadith. Once again, innamal a'malu binniyat. So one part of the science of hadith is looking at what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. And the other part of hadith, which is probably the more important part for this video, is the science of the isnad, looking at the sanad, the chain of transmission of the hadith itself. That is the most important part, really, of this video, so we'll be focusing on that. As I showed in the hadith Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about one's intentions when they do any action, I stated a sahaba. So I said, Umar bin Khattab said that he heard Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say X. Why is this important? Well, in the science of hadith, whenever there is a hadith said about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have to look at the chains of transmission. To understand the chains of transmission, let's go back a couple hundred years ago, basically. Let's say that we were living not in the times of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not in the times of tabi'in, those who followed the Sahaba, but in the times of those who followed the tabi'in. So those are three generations. We're in the third generation. There's the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his companions, then the tabi'in, then those who followed the tabi'un. Okay, so we're in the third generation. Let's say that somebody said that I heard there's a hadith from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, and we want to verify whether or not that is actually the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, how would that work? How would somebody delving deep into the science of hadith look into whether or not the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually said this? Well, the way that is actually shown, the way to tell if he actually said this is by looking at the chain of narration. And generally, when people would say hadith, when they would codify hadith, they wouldn't just say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. They would have to say that I heard. Let's say the tabi'in, one of the followers of the Sahaba, said, I heard that Umar bin Khattab said that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. So there's this chain linking all of the people who said the hadith all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Let's say, for instance, that we go forward to the sixth generation. We have the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam tabi'in, those who follow the tabi'in, and then the other ones tell the sixth generation. If somebody is coming to us saying, there's this hadith that needs to be codified, how would we codify it? Is that we see the chain of transmission. This individual coming to us said, I heard from this person, who heard from this person, who heard from this person, who heard from this tabi'in, who heard from this person, who heard from the Sahaba, who said the Sahaba said, I heard from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say X. So it has to be this unbreakable chain. So this is the chain of transmission. Now, in the hadith grading system, there are a couple of grades that are important to understand. First is, as I mentioned before about the hadith of intention, Sahih. Sahih means it is a sound, valid, it is 100% what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. We'll be delving deep into what Sahih actually means in a bit. Let's go over the other grading systems. Then there's Hasan. Hasan is that it is a okay, like a fine hadith, but we can't say for certain that is actually what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. In the grading system, that'd be kind of like a B. Like, we're not 100% certain this is a hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but we have good enough evidence to show that it is most likely the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then there's da'if. Those hadith that are weak. Those have a lot of issues that when you say it's da'if, nobody really takes them into consideration as if the Prophet Muhammad said that. Then those are fabricated hadiths where it is proven that the Prophet Muhammad did not actually say that. There's one famous hadith in which it was reported that the Prophet said, go study knowledge even if you have to go to China. He never actually said that. That's fabricated. However, when is a hadith sahih? Why is a hadith graded perfect 10 out of 10? Then why are other hadiths with a less rating? Well, let us look at when a hadith is perfect, a sahih hadith. When it is graded, when there is no doubt that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. In order for a hadith to be considered sahih, the main thing is the chain of transmission. And we're going to explain this in two ways. First, our hadiths that are mutawatir, and then hadiths that are ahad. We'll delve deep into these right now. Mutawatir hadiths are hadiths when the chain of transmission, there are so many people who say in each of those chains of narration that same hadith, that there is no doubt that that hadith is fabricated. In Ibn Qudama's Usul al-Fiqh book, Rawd al-Nadir, he says that when something is mutawatir, it is ilm daruri. It is basically something like necessarily it is true. Like you don't need any convincing that a hadith or thing that's transmitted mutawatir is sound. You just believe it because of how many people have actually said it. To understand mutawatir and why this is so important in hadith science, let's say for instance that 100 people come out of a building and say that the building is on fire. 100 people. If 100 people came out of that building and said that the building is on fire, even though you might not be able to see the fire itself, they say, guys, we all saw the fire. And everybody says, yeah, we saw the fire. 100 people say the words, we saw there's a fire in the building, everybody run. If 100 people said this to you, would you believe them or would you go inside your building? I'd be kind of crazy if you don't believe that 100 people told you there's a fire inside this building. Another example, let's say you go to school, you're in a college classroom, and then all of a sudden, as you're walking to your class, all 45 students come out saying, the teacher said he is not coming, he came in, then he left, and he said he's not coming, we're not going to have class today. Would you believe those 45 students, or would you go inside the classroom? Well, obviously, if all 45 students said, we saw the teacher walk into the classroom, say, we're not having class, and then leave, then there's no reason for you not to believe those 45. And that's mutawatir in a nutshell, that so many people have said that they saw or heard the exact same thing. And the important element of mutawatir are really two. One is that all of those people who say they heard or saw X, they actually all individually saw or heard X. Meaning, it's not considered mutawatir if one guy out of the 100 said, we saw the fire in the building. Because that's one guy saying it. It necessitates that, no, every single person said that they saw the fire. Or that every single person says that they saw the teacher come in the classroom say there's no more class. So it necessitates all of those 100, all those 40, to say they saw or heard X. The other thing about mutawatir is that there is such a large amount of people saying they heard or saw X. Now, there are differences of opinions among scholars of when is something considered mutawatir. However, really the best opinion that a lot of scholars use is the one taken by Ibn Qudama, where something is considered mutawatir when there is just no doubt about the veracity of that claim. That there is no doubt that that large number of people that somehow, without any qara'in, without any outside source saying, oh, those are liars or they're trying to prank you, that if all of those people just come out and say we all saw the fire, that whatever large amount of number would give you yaqeen, meaning that it would give you like factual knowledge, basically. You have no doubt because of how many people say it. That is what is considered mutawatir. Once again, if one person came out of the classroom saying that we have no class, you might doubt it. However, if 50 people came out of the classroom and said we have no class, and we saw the teacher who came to class and we heard him say there's no class, you won't have any doubt. So that is the top tier Sahih Hadith, mutawatir Hadith, that has no doubt whatsoever that whatever the person said or whatever those people say to you, because of how many people there are, and that all of them say that they heard or saw X thing, that there's no doubt that it actually happened. So now how do we understand mutawatir in the science of hadith prior to going into a hadith al-ahad, the other way of showing that a hadith is sound? Where for a mutawatir hadith to have such a high level, to say that this hadith is mutawatir, what it means that in each chain of the narration, there are in each of those chains such a large group of people saying the exact same hadith. Such as I said, if there was 50 people who came to you and said that we're not having class, we saw the professor and heard the professor say we're not having class, because there's a large amount of people, you have no doubt about that. At face value, prima facie, you don't have no doubt at that information. And that's what mutawatir is. Then every chain going down to you hearing this hadith, it is mutawatir. It is that all of those aspects, every chain has that level of certainty within the chain reaching to you. So to put this in perspective, let's say once again we're on the 6th generation of the people from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the 6th group. In order for something to be, let's say, mutawatir, it would mean that we have a hadith from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That hadith goes to the Sahaba, but it's not one Sahaba saying it. It is a mutawatir number of Sahaba saying it. Let's say 25, 30 Sahaba saying this exact same hadith. Then those people, those Sahabas, say to the tabi'in, the people next to them, saying the exact same hadith to them. So let's say one person in the chain says it to 5 people. Let's say another person says it to 1 person. Let's say another person says it to 7 people. And they're all saying in different areas, different places in time, they are saying the exact same hadith to the next chain in the narration. So we start off with 50 Sahaba hearing this one hadith, or let's say 30 Sahaba hearing this one hadith. Those Sahaba say it to the next group of people. Those groups of people, let's say it becomes 70, because each one are saying it to, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of the next generation. Then we have the followers of the tabi'in. Let's say those tabi'in is from 70, let's say it goes down to 30. Then the next link in the chain, let's go say those 30 groups of people, they go and they say it, and it ends up becoming 50 groups who heard from those tabi'in the exact same hadith. And it goes all the way down to, let's say, the 6th generation where we compile all of the hadiths, the chains of narration, and we see that in every chain of narration, it is a mutawatir hadith, that in every chain, there is so many people saying the exact same hadith to different people in different places. Really, that's crazy. There's no way that that's not true. That all of them say, I heard from this person, I heard from that person, and becomes a perfect chain of the same hadith, by the same amount of people, by a large amount of people in each chain going down, from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam going downward. So when transmitting this hadith, saying Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whatever it is that he said, those people who are mastering the hadith, they would have to, in terms of seeing who these hadith scholars are, they would have to report the chain of narration that they personally heard. So then it would become, they would know who was the one, where did they get this hadith? Who was the one that reported this hadith to them? And really, hearing this, it's just so clear that there's no way Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not say this hadith. Really. So in looking over this video again, I know there were some parts that are a little bit confusing, so I'm leaving this off at the end to kind of summarize a mutawatir hadith. Once again, there's Sahih. A mutawatir hadith is when in each link of the chain connecting to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there is one, there's no breakage in the link, and 2, that there is such a large group of people in each link of the chain saying that they heard this person say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. So look at this graph that ChatGPT brought us. So let's look at the top. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, whatever it is. You see that all of these Sahaba, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 30, whatever it is, they all heard the exact same hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then these guys, these Sahaba, these 30 Sahaba, they go tell to some of their students, let's say, the Tabi'een, those following the Sahaba. So one guy would say it to one person. Maybe a number 2 here would say it to 2 people. And number 3, number 4, 30, whatever it is, they all say it to a bunch of people. Those Tabi'een, when they are going to report the Hadith, they will have to say that this Sahaba, let's say Abu Hurairah, said to me that he heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying X. That's how it is. Now let's go to the last stage. These group of Tabi'een, they're going to say it to their student, the followers of the Tabi'een, whoever it is. And one of them might say it to 3 people, one of them might say it to 4 people, one of them might say it to 1 person, one might not even say it to anybody, one of them might say it to 5, 7 people. Doesn't really matter. And those guys, those final chain of people, let's say just in this image, those 5, when they are going to transmit the Hadith, they're going to say that I heard from this Tabi'een, who heard from this Sahaba, who this Sahaba heard from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying X. That is the unbreakable link, the link to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that there's no breakage in the transmission. Now those studying Hadith, what they do is they get the Hadith, and they see who are the people who said this Hadith. And they look at all of the chain. So they look at the Sahaba. They look at how many Sahabis said this Hadith. Let's say there's 30. Then they look at how many people reported that those Sahabis said that same Hadith. So they'll look at the chain going basically backwards, starting from the bottom rather than from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this image that's on the screen right now, they will look at the bottom part, the Tabi'een at the bottom, and they'll go backwards to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they will check each and individual Tabi'een. How many of those guys have reported the exact same Hadith? Then backwards, how many of those guys have referenced one of the Tabi'eens prior to them? Then they will mark, okay, how many are there? Then they'll mention, okay, how many of those guys mentioned the Sahabi? Okay, how many Sahabas were mentioned? Then they tally them all up and see, okay, how many people in each link of the chain. If there is a mutawatir, meaning if there is so many people in each link of the chain looking at different people, then it is considered a Sahih mutawatir hadith. And the reason why this is impossible to be fake, to be not the words of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is because there's no way there is such a mass corroboration of people lying, especially when Hadith scholars look at the names of these people. They look at the names of these people and they see, well, there's no way they all could have lied. Because once again, it's not the case that they all said these hadiths in one room to 30 people. Some of these Sahaba, some of these Tabi'een, some of the other Tabi'een, they might have said it to other people in different places. One might have said it in Mecca, one might have said it in Medina. So they're in different places, but they're saying the same hadith with the same Sahaba, with the same Tabi'een. So a mass corroboration of people lying, saying the same thing when they are known not to lie, that is why it is impossible. This would not be what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually said. So that is how a Sahih mutawatir hadith works in a nutshell. I hope this made it a little bit more clearer. The other section, let's say, of Sahih hadiths are Hadith Ahad. And Hadith Ahad is when there is a chain of narration, what Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. However, in one of the chains, it doesn't reach the level of mutawatir. It reaches the level of ahad, meaning that instead of, let's say, 30, 40 people saying the same hadith, there's like 3 people in that one chain saying the hadith. All it requires for a hadith to be at the grading of ahad is that in one of the chain, it doesn't reach the level of mutawatir. That's it. Now, Hadith Ahad has a couple of more rules to it before we actually believe it. How do we know that a Hadith Ahad is Sahih when it's not at the same level as Mutawatir, some would say? Well, they are at the same level, but the difference with Hadith Ahad is that when it comes to that chain of, let's say, 3 people saying something, we have to know who those people are that are saying those hadiths. So for instance, let's say you go to your classroom, okay? 2 students come out and say, hey, there's no class today. If you know those students, and you know that they have never lied, they are trustworthy, they are upright people, they've never done anything bad, and you know that they are just good people, you would believe them. If your best friend, who hopefully is a good person, your best friend came up to you saying, hey, there's no school tomorrow. I heard the teacher say there's no school tomorrow. You would believe your best friend. You don't need other reports because you know he's not going to lie to you unless your best friend lies to you. But let's say your best friend does not lie to you. Let's say this is a perfect best friend who doesn't lie to you, has been an upright person his entire life, and has not committed any outright bad sin. In that case, you would believe your best friend or those two people coming out of the classroom. And that's how Hadith Ahad works. That when one of the chains of that narration, the perfect chain that's linked, more on that later, if one of those chains only has a handful of people that doesn't reach that level of mutawatir, then we have to look at those people saying that hadith. Are they trustworthy? Are they bad people? Are they evil? Have they done anything wrong? Have they committed an open sin? Are they Muslim? If none of those aspects are present, like they are just a great human being, Muslim, everything, and trustworthy, they've never lied, they've always told the truth, then once again, there's no reason to doubt that individual. The same way you wouldn't doubt your amazingly perfect best friend. You would believe those two students coming out of the classroom if you actually knew who they were. If you didn't know who they were, that's a different issue. In Hadith Ahad, we literally have no idea who this person is, then we put an X on that person. And we look at the ones that we do know and whether or not they are upright individuals. So that's Hadith Ahad. Now, when it comes to Sahih, outside of knowing the people who are perfect, and another most important element of Hadith is the chain of narration, is that in each one they are connected with a chain. Meaning, let's say, for instance, let us say that there is a tabi'in, those people who came after the Sahaba, meaning that they did not see the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One of the tabi'in, they say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, okay? But they didn't mention the companion. It could very well be that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. However, because he did not mention the Sahaba, who would have said, I heard the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying X, that hadith is not Sahih. He could be the most upright guy, but because he does not have that perfect chain connected to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that hadith goes down a grade to Hasan. Basically, if the one chain is broken, the hadith is no longer Sahih. If one chain is broken, if one of those people, let's say there's Hadith Ahad, and in one of those chains, there is a perfect chain, but those people in one of those chains, all of them are some people we don't know, or we doubt if they're good or not, then that hadith is no longer Sahih. So to summarize this section of when a hadith is Sahih, when it's a sound hadith, is like a perfect, we know the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, is one, when there's a perfect chain. That if we're on the 6th generation, that there is a perfect, that we can go all the way back from us, hearing this person say X, from that person say, I heard it from this person, that person saying, I heard it from that person, then that person saying, I heard it from that person, to all the way back to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning there's a perfect chain of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying X, the Sahaba hearing it, the Tabi'in hearing it, the other person hearing it, all the way down. There's a perfect chain leading to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no broken link. The second most important is either if the hadith is mutawatir, meaning that each of those chains of transmission have such a large amount of people that it is basically, that there's no doubt that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this. Because once again, for each of the chain, having like 30, 50, 40 people saying it, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, then there's no doubt that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X. It's just impossible to be such a large corroboration of evil people changing what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said at different times. It's like impossible. But more importantly, even for mutawatir hadiths and hadith ahad, which by the way, a long time ago there was no distinction here. There's more of an usul al-fiqh distinction. But the other important element is to look at all of those people in the chain. Even mutawatir hadith, they look at every single person who said this hadith. If they don't know who the person is, they have doubt about this person. They think this person is a bad person. This person has been shown to lie. This person has had a bad memory. Even memory is an important trait. If you have a bad memory, then you could be the most upright guy in the world, but we're not taking your hadith for granted. Meaning that if somebody has a bad memory, he has mistaken one hadith, then you can no longer take that person into consideration when saying the hadith. Then that chain is broken. So when it comes to hadith, Sahih hadith, the chain is not broken. It goes all back to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And two, that all of the people who are saying this hadith in every area of the chain are good, stand-up Muslim people saying those hadiths. And hadiths become bad, hasan, da'if, fabricated, when one of those elements are missing, when the chain is broken, or when those people are not upright people. Once again, if a tabi'een said that I heard that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said X, he did not mention the Sahaba, he could have the best memory, most upright individual, all that, but the hadith is no longer Sahih. It is Hasan because he broke one of the links off. If the link is perfect, but a lot of those people we don't know, or in one of the chains of narration, those people we don't know who they are, that is no longer a Sahih hadith. Now there's much more to delve deep into, but that is the general thing, that when it comes to hadith literature, it is based on testimony, and it is based on looking at who are the people who are transmitting this hadith. Hadith scientists, those who deal and actually study hadith, they don't just memorize the text of the hadith. They memorize the entire chain leading back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is hadith literature. The science of hadith is looking at who are the people saying this hadith. Is there an unbroken chain to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So the entire thing of hadith literature is based on testimony. And prior to looking at historical critical method, many times people doubt testimony. For those doubting it, if you doubt testimony, then you have to doubt science. You have to doubt every other field in human history. Science, philosophy, many of these fields are based on testimony. What Socrates has said, what Plato said, what Aristotle have said is all testimony of a person saying they heard Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. Science is built on testimony. Nobody has actually seen Darwin doing his experiments. Nobody has seen Darwin actually looking at animals and looking at the monkeys and whatever the case is. But we know it based on the testimony that he said he has done this. And interestingly, philosophers, epistemologists, those dealing with the study of knowledge, really nobody has doubts of testimony. Philosophers don't have doubts of testimony. Michael Huemer, in his Epistemology Contemporary Reading book, says about testimony, the testimony of others provide us with justification so long as it seems believable, and no defeaters are present. Another one of his books, he says, if it seems to you that P, then you have at least prima facie justification for believing P, unless you have defeaters. What Michael Huemer is stating, and what it is generally the consensus among the majority of epistemologists, is that if somebody, especially somebody trustworthy, but he doesn't mention trustworthy, but us had people who deal, like the Muslims who deal with hadith, say if it's a very trustworthy, no sinning person, says to you something, then on prima facie just value, you have justification for believing that thing that he says. There's no reason to go and doubt that. There's no reason for you to doubt that that person is lying, tricking you. Because on face value, we believe what people are telling us. Unless there's a qara'in, and this is something that many hadith scholars and people of Usul Fiqh say, unless you find that that person obviously is a liar, or those groups of people are doing a prank on you. Outside of that, why would we not believe that person? Why would we throw doubt at that individual? The only reason we do that is because we're built with a skepticism in mind. But if we're built with that skepticism, then we should throw away the moon landing. We should throw away every event in human history. We should throw away everything unless we've seen it. All of science should be thrown in the trash. Because you people watching this video have not done the scientific evidence, the health benefits of vaccines. Yet if somebody were to doubt vaccines, you would critique them, you would make fun of them, you would say they're crazy. Yet you believing vaccines is based on testimony, the testimony of 1, 2, or 3, or a couple of doctors. It is based simply on testimony. If you have not read any single scientific article, which many have not, of why vaccines are good, you have prima facie justification to believe vaccines are good simply based on the testimony of so many doctors, of trustworthy doctors in their field. The same goes for Hadith. So in looking at this Hadith section of the video, we see the Hadiths and the science of Hadith is so immensely beautiful. We're not just looking at, if somebody said it, we believe it. We're strict. We want a chain to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's why we have no doubt that when we see Hadith in Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, and we see the Sahih grading, we have no doubt that that is what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. And if you doubt that after what I explained to you, then you are simply a skeptic. Then doubt vaccines, doubt the moon landing, doubt Tylenol, doubt all of those things. The only reason people doubt this is when it comes to religion. When it does not come to religion, people take testimony in face value with a far less scrutinizing methodology. Michael Huemer and other epistemologists, they don't even discuss the level of detail that Muslims have in the Hadith science. We take it even at an even greater level, that we need to know there has to be a perfect chain. Michael Huemer and others, they don't discuss this because this is solely as something special with the Hadith science in the Islamic sciences. So that is this section of understanding what Hadiths are, understanding the science of Hadith and why Hadiths are a reliable source of knowledge. But prior to ending this video, we need to look at something important. We need to look at the historical critical method and why, even though many academics praise it, it is not free of error. Now, the historical critical method is a way that academics, historians, try to see history, try to see texts, how to analyze texts from the past in history. And it's a method of analyzing those texts, seeing what was the author of the text trying to say, what was the political, the historical, the theological realm that the author was thinking when specifically writing that text out. Now, while many academics use the historical critical method, the historical critical method is not perfect. There are problems in the historical critical method. The main problem with the historical critical method is that it presupposes naturalism. Everything is only in the natural world. That whatever is in the natural world, that's what we can detect and discuss. So when it comes to miracles, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for instance, splitting the moon. If there's a report saying the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam split the moon, then for somebody who does the historical critical method, they won't even uphold that. They'll say there was a political reason why they're saying this. They won't uphold that it is a miracle. However, Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher in the past, even he argues against the historical critical method exactly for this, that it upholds a naturalistic frame of mind. It upholds naturalism, meaning that there's nothing outside this realm. But if you talk to a lot of philosophers, not all philosophers, not many philosophers, some may even say most philosophers, are not hardcore naturalists. There are maybe things that are outside of this natural world. They are metaphysical. So that's another problem with the historical critical method and why it's not a perfect assessment, a perfect method to look at historical texts. To kind of summarize the problems with the historical critical method, for starters, it is a method only. It is just a method, meaning it's not the benchmark for all things of what is true or not true. It is a method that many historians use to analyze texts, but it does not mean that through the historical critical method can we literally find the truth in everything. And one of the reasons, and the main reason why the historical critical method is problematic, is because it presupposes naturalism, as I stated previously. But to explain that more, the historical critical method, like science, presupposes that only through the natural world do things come about. They don't understand metaphysics, things outside of this natural world. Now, somebody might say, well, yes, there's no such thing as a metaphysical world. You're already working with that pre-assumption in mind. So you have to argue and defend your strict naturalism. The other problem with historical critical method in the methodology of it is that many historians try to understand what a text say through their own reasoning and intellect without understanding, like, let's say, divine inspiration. For instance, somebody looking at the historical critical method might look at the Quran, verses of the Quran talking about Jahannam, Jannah, and so on and so forth, with that assumption, with that muqaddimah of naturalism, and they might explain it not in a divine way, not in a religiously oriented way, but through a naturalistic way, explaining it through a political reason. There was a political reason why, let's say, the Bible or the Quran discusses heaven or hell. And what it is a bunch of historians in the 21st century putting their pre-assumptions into the text and trying to see what did the author actually mean when he was writing this thing out, or when he was trying to say this one thing. Another problem with the historical critical method as a method is that there's a bunch of historians looking at this text and trying to see what was the purpose of the author. But this kind of takes away truth, because it's historians, once again, in the 21st century discussing what the truth of this text is saying in their 21st century mind. So what that means is they may reject the text, or they may say that, oh, the reason the author said X was for Y reason, but the only reason they're saying that is because they can't comprehend another reason why people in the past would say or do anything. They only look at it through their own perspective. And once again, this is a method. The main fundamental issue with the historical critical method, especially when discussing academia, is 1, people think it's more than a method. It's a criterion for truth. And 2, it already presupposes naturalism. It already presupposes a secular world view. And while some atheists may uphold that, there needs to be an argument in support of the naturalism prior to even stating that the historical critical method is fact, is the criterion for truth. So that is somewhat the sum of the problems of the historical critical method in a nutshell. And to end off this video, prior to saying Assalamu alaikum to you guys, I will leave this video off with a video from Wael Halak, in which he discusses Muslims who are in academia trying to fit Islam into the Western academic realm. And Wael Halak is basically saying that Islam is advanced in other ways where the Western method, the Western academics are not. Western academia changes so many times, has majority of philosophers, majority of scientists, majority of academics believed in X, only for 100 years later for that opinion to change. Whereas in Islam, we don't have that. We have a strict method of keeping what was in the past, looking at Hadith, for instance. So there's no reason for Muslims to try to fit in Islam, Islamic understanding, Islamic sciences with Western sciences, because, as Wael Halak is arguing, Western sciences in some areas are weaker than Islamic. Where Islam is stronger, in, let's say, the Isnad, the Hadith science, there's no reason to put it into the historical critical method, which is flawed, much more flawed than the Hadith sciences. I hope you guys enjoyed this clip from Wael Halak, and I will see you guys later, and Assalamu alaikum.
There are many people who are trying to square the triangle, make Islam fit into the liberal mold. Well, I'm not sure why first if it's possible, and why do we need to do this? This is an act of contortion that will never succeed. And when I say that Islam cannot fit in the liberal mode, I don't mean that Islam is not good enough to fit in the liberal mode. I mean that Islam has its own identity and power and energy and its tools and vibrancy, that it can stand on its own. It has an independent voice. It has its own set of values. It has its own way of dealing and seeing the world. And so if you were to want to say, oh, well, you know what, we cannot really revive that old Islam, so at least let's change Islam in such a way as to make it fit and call it Islam. But this is what Shakht actually advised Muslims. You know what Shakht did, the father of Islamic law? What he did was to write the history of the first century of the Hijrah, saying absolutely it has nothing to do with Islam. Islamic law arose, the Sharia arose in the first century by thieving Roman law, Jewish law, and other laws, and giving a veneer, that's his word, a veneer that is Islamic. So everything is not Islamic, but there is a veneer Islamic, and Muslims managed to convince themselves to live with it until the 20th century. And now they need to reform their law again. So why don't they just borrow from the West again? And he said that clearly in a 1970 article, I believe 79, I'm not sure, and give it another Islamic veneer, and that's it. That's exactly what these Muslims are doing. They are following closely Shaykh's advice. That is a bankrupt kind of scholarship. If it roams around, scholarship is highly problematic, by the way. I mean, you could have a whole production of hundreds and hundreds of books on the same theme, and then 20 years later, there is revision. They believe in it as the ultimate truth when it is there, and nobody can question it. And then 20 years later, it becomes susceptible to revision, and then it becomes old scholarship. There's no truth about anything.
Yeah, so